Chapter 5. Angels in Disguise. Building a Hospital, 1984-1995.
Sport is ruthless. Before my mother's death, I was never a compassionate person. In cricket, if you do not crush your opponent, he will crush you. I gave no quarter and asked for none. You cannot become one of the top sportsmen in your country without having a ruthless killer instinct. I had the same mindset when I dealt with the underprivileged in our society. Rather than having my pity, they had my contempt. They were poor because they were indolent and unwilling to work hard. Most of our elite classes have this attitude towards the poor, and Western governments have this attitude towards the developing world. My experience founding a hospital overturned these views, teaching me a great deal about both my fellow countrymen and myself. I saw the true potential of ordinary Pakistani people and overcame not just my own prejudices, but also some of my own insecurities. With this, I was drawing closer still to the idea of trying to help Pakistan politically. Besides, in challenging the status quo, and trying to fill a social security void left by a succession of Pakistani leaders, I found myself dragged into politics whether I liked it or not. When, in 1984, my mother was suffering during the last few weeks of her life, I went to see a doctor in Lahore's Mayo Hospital, where I was born, to seek his advice. I was sitting in his waiting room when an old man walked in with a desperate expression on his face. It was etched with pain that I immediately recognized as my own, and had seen on the faces of my father and my sisters for past few months. He was holding a piece of paper in one hand and some medicines in the other. Being unable to read, he gave it to the doctor's assistant and asked him if he had bought all the medication that was needed. The assistant told him there was one missing. "How much will it cost?" asked the old man. When the assistant quoted the figure, a despairing and hopeless expression spread across the man's face, and without another word, he turned and walked out. I asked the assistant what the problem was. He told me that this old Pashtun from Nowshera, a town in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, had brought in his brother who was dying of cancer. Because there was no bed for the sick man, he was lying in the corridor. This man would labor all day on a construction site nearby and look after his brother for the rest of the time. Although the government-run Mayo Hospital is supposed to be free, patients have to buy their own medicines. Having taken my mother for cancer treatment in London, I fully realized how expensive cancer drugs were. Even the cost of the morphine-based painkillers, if they were available at all, was exorbitant. Moreover, cancer treatment could last anything between 6 months to 2 years. Now it is possible to die of cancer pain-free, but at the time there was no concept of pain management in Pakistan. Here was I with all my resources and influence, yet I and my family were in such a desperate state. What must this poor man have been going through? I pondered over this during the rest of my mother's illness, and that old Pashtun's despairing face kept appearing before my eyes. One of the first things that had struck me when I took my mother for medical care in England was that she was suffering from what should have been a curable cancer, if it had been diagnosed and treated early enough. It pained me too that we had had to take her out of the country for treatment. Anyone who has been through this experience will understand what an ordeal this is for patients and their loved ones, irrespective of their wealth. Being abroad and far from your family support system, sometimes for months at a time, makes a hard situation harder still. It was then that I resolved to build a cancer hospital where anyone could walk in without having to worry about the cost of treatment and with the rich not having to seek treatment abroad. However, at this stage one had no idea what it took to build a specialist cancer hospital, let alone in an underdeveloped country. As I began to make inquiries, I discovered that the government of Punjab had tried to build a cancer hospital in the 1980s. Despite all the money that was allocated to it, the plan was eventually abandoned because it was deemed unfeasible, too expensive to build and even more expensive to run. Besides, there were only 2 to 3 oncologists in the entire country and they would be reluctant to accept paltry government salaries. A cancer hospital also needed the most expensive equipment. Pakistan did not have enough qualified engineers to fix this equipment if anything went wrong. For a while I was too busy with my cricket to give the idea any more attention. However, after 1987, I again began to ponder how to go about getting the project off the ground. The more people, especially doctors, that I spoke to, the more they discouraged me. I was having serious doubts at this stage and it is possible that I would have kept postponing the project, when in 1988 a cousin of mine, Imran Khan, organized a fundraising dinner while I was playing a cricket tournament in Dubai. This was our first one and we collected about $20,000. After that there was no turning back. When I returned to Pakistan I gathered a few people together and formed a trust and a board of governors. Parvez Hassan, a lawyer with a strong background in working for charities, and entrepreneur Razak Dawood joined the initiative and were to become completely involved. My friends Ashik Qureshi and Azmat Ali Khan, who tragically later passed away from cancer in the hospital, also came on board. Babar Ali, a well-known businessman from an old Lahore family, lent his name to the project, as did the future finance minister of Pakistan, Shaukat Tareen. My father became chairman of the board. Then we organized a meeting with 20 of the top doctors in Lahore to guide the board of governors of this trust on how to proceed further. All bar one of these doctors said the project was simply not feasible in Pakistan. One said that it was, but there was no way we would be able to treat the poor for free. The average cost of treating a cancer patient was too high. We were totally demoralized after the meeting. I had no idea how to deal with the situation. I could not get out of the project because not only had I publicly announced it but much more significantly I had already started to collect money. My cousin, the cricketer Javed Burki, suggested I just build a big dispensary in my mother's name and give up on the hospital ideal. My sisters, who were worried about me, suggested I should drop the plan or I would lose all the respect and credibility I had gained from my cricketing career. But it was too late. Even if I wanted to I could not. How could I return people's donations? Just as I was getting desperate, an encouraging meeting with the Pakistani Association of North American Doctors spurred me on. Their promise of help encouraged me to cut down on my cricket commitments so I could concentrate on the project. I set up an office given to me for free by a friend, Omar Farooq, and hired our first employee. Initially I did not work on the hospital out of the kind of passion I had once had for cricket. I had decided to build it for the poor, but my motivation was not out of any great feeling of responsibility towards society. It felt more like an obligation or a mission and stemmed from immense personal pain in the memory of that vulnerable moment seeing the old Pashtun in the doctor's waiting room. I was motivated too by the feeling that had there been a specialized cancer hospital in Pakistan, my mother could have been saved. My sense of charity was still limited though. My mother used to take a percentage of my cricket earnings each year to give zakat to the poor but after she died I stopped. I had lost a lot of money after putting all my savings in shares just before the world stock markets crashed in 1987. By this stage my spiritual journey had started and I could not help wondering if I had been punished in some way because I had not cleansed my money by giving zakat. I still did not give out of conviction, though, that was to come later, after I saw the generosity of the common man in Pakistan and my faith had developed to the point where I realized charity is not an option, it is a duty. The more people ridiculed the hospital project and told me it could never be done, the more determined I was to prove them wrong. This was one of the characteristics that had helped me in cricket. I was dropped after my first test for Pakistan, and most of the players ridiculed my cricket, saying that I had made my first and last appearance for my country. But it was a huge burden. I was told the hospital would be a white elephant. Others said I should focus on building a facility for primary care, saying a cancer hospital was too ambitious. But I was doing this because of the death of my mother, which had made me realize there was no cancer hospital in Pakistan. What will happen to poor people with cancer? I would ask. They will die anyway, was their reply. One day, somebody from my social circle accused me in front of some friends of doing it all for publicity, just as celebrities endorse charities to get their names in the papers. I nearly hit him. His sneering was typical of certain sections of Pakistan's elite. They are completely decadent and utterly cynical. Desperately envious of anyone who has succeeded in the West, they are keen to drag you down to their level if you so much as aspire to help the country. The only other time I truly lost my cool in the face of detractors was in England. I met with a group of British Pakistani doctors at Shazan restaurant in Knightsbridge and they started to ask me a lot of technical questions about how the hospital would work. One of them in particular ridiculed the whole plan. He badgered me on technical points, as if to taunt me with my lack of medical knowledge. He told me this was not my field, that I would fail and ruin the great reputation I had made from my cricketing career. I almost left the dinner, so furious was I. The problem was that I was consulting all these doctors, but doctors, like most technocrats, are enslaved by logic. They are concerned with practicalities, whilst I was always a dreamer and my struggle in cricket had taught me to believe that nothing was impossible if one never gave up. They were realists whereas I was and always have been an idealist. However, the concept of the hospital was still not clear at this stage. We had a volunteer doctor who was helping us, but unfortunately she did not have the experience to undertake such a huge project. Our big break was still to come. I was in New York for a festival cricket match when I happened to meet a Pakistani cancer specialist called Dr. Tausif Ahmed at a dinner party. I told him of the project's difficulties. He responded by saying that there was only one Pakistani doctor he knew who had the capability of handling such a massive undertaking. The man in question happened to be none other than my first cousin Dr. Noshirwan Burki, my mother's favorite nephew. It was Noshirwan who took on the entire medical side of the project, while I began to concentrate on the fundraising. A huge burden was lifted from my shoulders. Although there were a lot of people who played a heroic role in building the hospital, I have no doubt that Noshirwan was the most crucial. Had I not met him at that point in time, I would still be groping in the dark. At his first presentation to the board, we all heaved a huge sigh of relief. Here finally was somebody who really knew what they were doing. He gave us the confidence that this dream could one day become a reality. Noshirwan was no ordinary doctor. Not only is he an outstanding pulmonologist, but his brilliant mind was always curious about every aspect of the health system. This was the perfect challenge for him. From the United States, where he was a professor at Kentucky University Hospital, he planned every aspect of the project, from selecting the architects, hiring the medical staff and, using his contacts in Kentucky, getting the best quality equipment at the best prices. Although my quest for God had begun after my mother passed away, I was still leading a self-centered way of life. However, my faith in the hospital grew together. The hospital tested my belief in God to the limit and all the time kept strengthening it. In turn, my growing faith helped the hospital. It was a symbiotic relationship. The project removed all doubts within me that were it not for the will of God, it would have failed due to the many blunders made by me and my well-meaning but inexperienced team. So many times the situation appeared hopeless, yet somehow things would work out. When the hospital opened after a record construction time of 3.25 years, rather than feel arrogant and brag about it, I felt totally humble. Another great lesson in building the hospital was overcoming my pride and bringing my ego under control. Ever since I can remember, I have always wanted to be self-contained, and hated to ask anyone for anything. I would feel a loss of dignity even asking my father for money, whereas Pakistanis often have no problem accepting money from their parents. When I announced the hospital project and the expected funds did not come, I was left with no option but to go out and ask for money. This was harder than anything I had ever done. I just cannot express how humiliating I found it to be kept waiting by certain businessmen who knew I had come to ask for funds. There were some who deliberately wanted to put me in my place, as they thought I was arrogant. As a sought-after cricket star, I would pick and choose from the many invitations I received. I often turned down those from people who had made a lot of money and wanted to use their newfound wealth to rub shoulders with the famous. Now I had to turn to these people for donations. The media also tried to settle old scores. As a cricketer, the press had needed me and I had been able to be selective about which journalists I talked to. If one wrote anything nasty about me, I would simply cut them off. Now I had to court them, so that they would highlight my project and help me raise funds. One bad article could mean the loss of huge amounts of donations. So I badly needed their goodwill. For the sake of the cause, I really had to grovel to certain journalists and I found it simply excruciating. I also changed towards children. Ever since I became a successful cricketer, my biggest followers were kids. There was, however, one problem: I just did not know how to behave with them. I was one of those adults who felt totally ill at ease with them. Whenever I was at home in Lahore, people would bring their children to meet me. Most of the time I would be so awkward about having to face yet another horde of them that I would tell my sisters to say I was not at home. My poor mother, who loved children, would be furious and force me to see them. All this changed. After 1.5 years of fundraising, I ran out of steam in 1990. What I have learned from running a charity is that if you have to raise 100 rupees, the first 10 are the hardest and the last 10 are the easiest. I had kept going back to the same people for funds and they simply did not want to hear any more about the hospital. There was terrible donor fatigue and it seemed that I had reached a dead end. We could not start the construction of the hospital without substantial funds. At this juncture a friend suggested that since children were my greatest fans, I should go to the schools and ask them to collect funds for me, which horrified me. However, my sister Alima, who had joined me in my mission, caught on to the idea. Within a month she had designed a whole fundraising campaign based on the children of Pakistan. It meant me going to schools all over the country, addressing them and inviting them to be in my fundraising team, which we named Imran's Tigers. Only those who were close to me would know how totally opposed to my nature this was. I worried that I would make a fool of myself and the children would make fun of me. I can never forget my first day addressing a school assembly in Lahore. Tense when I set out, I almost came to blows with another driver in my worst case of road rage. Drenched in sweat, I was so shy and awkward that a lot of the children began to giggle. We started campaigning at private schools but soon the state schools were also clamoring to join in. For 2 months I went to between 5 and 6 schools a day addressing their assemblies and explaining to them why it was important to have a cancer hospital in Pakistan. Each time before facing an assembly I had to muster all my courage to speak to them. Initially it was more terrifying than facing fast bowlers in front of a packed stadium. However, what happened as a result of my campaign was a sort of a mini revolution in the country. The school children created history. Never had there been such a successful fundraising campaign in the history of Pakistan. The children pestered their parents, uncles and aunts for money. They stopped motorists at traffic lights, and collected funds from door to door. Any child that collected over a certain amount of money would win a cricket bat signed by me. In a society like Pakistan where the family system is strong and children are adored, I found we had hit upon the best possible way to collect money. I would be eating in a restaurant and the moment children spotted me, they would ask their parents for money and then hand me their donations. Unlike in the UK or the United States, in Pakistan children go everywhere, restaurants, functions, marriages, because all life revolves around the family. Not only was a huge amount of money collected, but more significantly the children themselves made everyone in the country aware of the fact that in a population of what was then 140 million people there was no cancer hospital. The campaign succeeded beyond my wildest imagination and enabled us to start construction. Today I meet Pakistani professionals all over the world who proudly tell me that they participated in my school fundraising campaign. At the end of the campaign my inhibitions in dealing with children had disappeared and I felt really privileged that they looked up to me. Moreover, I began to give more and more of what I had to the hospital. I had not been raised to be extravagant. My parents were always careful with their money and had brought me and my sisters up with an awareness that since there was so much poverty around we should never be wasteful and should give any extra money or food to the poor. My father had founded a charity called the Pakistan Educational Society, which funded the university education of underprivileged but talented children. He made me a member of the board when I was 22. However, while previously I found it hard to give, and when I did give I felt I was doing the recipient a huge favor, now I gave out of a sense of duty and would feel satisfaction afterwards. From then on I would identify my needs, work out exactly what my expenses were for the year and whatever I made in excess of that I would give to the hospital. Now, I also donate to the university I have founded in Miyawali. I began to realize that once this exercise is done, it becomes fairly easy to start giving. Life became simpler and I ceased worrying about my earnings. I would never run out of money as an opportunity would always come up and I would make enough to keep me going. By the time the hospital opened in December 1994, I had given almost half of what I owned to the hospital. The project lurched from one crisis to another. We had found a 20-acre plot outside Lahore and ground was broken in April 1991. With barely 10 million rupees in the bank we were embarking on a 700 million rupee project. No wonder everyone was skeptical. You could never start a commercial project with that kind of financing. The problems were never ending, hiring people, construction delays, equipment issues and a constant struggle to meet costs. Every time we feared we would have to halt the project because of a lack of funds somebody would always appear at the last minute with a donation. Even our first chief executive, an American by the name of David Wood, said our goal to provide 75 to 80% free or financially assisted treatment was impossible. Backing up his argument with a PowerPoint presentation, he told the board that if we treated more than 5% of the patients for free, the hospital would close down within a few months. No other private cancer hospital in the world had managed what we were trying to achieve. But I had specifically promised people free treatment for the poor. And this was something many of our more impoverished donors held me to. Will it really be free for the poor? They would ask, wary after a lifetime of being let down by the rulers and elite of Pakistan. The board and I refused to compromise on our objective. Not only was the hospital going to provide the proposed amount of free treatment, it had to be state-of-the-art, and it had to be a research center. I had no idea at this stage how to finance the free treatment. We overruled Wood. The surge in donations and goodwill during the post-World Cup euphoria sustained us for a while, but by 1994 the situation was coming to a head. It was a real uphill battle because we kept running out of funds and I had to constantly travel to tap overseas Pakistanis for help. In 1994 I toured New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, the UK, Norway, Germany, Denmark, Holland, the United States, Canada, the UAE, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. Wherever in the world there was a Pakistani community, I was there asking them for money. By the summer of that year, donor fatigue had got to the point where rich donors would hide if they saw me. This was when the real money was needed. Construction had to be completed, staff had to be hired, down payments for equipment had to be made. To make matters worse, I got unnecessarily involved in a ball tampering controversy in June 1994, which made fund collection even more difficult. The two great Pakistani fast bowlers Wasim Akram and Waqar Yunus, who had been nurtured and groomed by me and whose success I took great pride in, had decimated England back in 1992. Sadly, some English cricketers and British tabloids blamed their supreme ability in reverse swinging on ball tampering. I could not bear to see such unfair treatment of two great fast bowlers. I gave an interview to a biographer about reverse swing and ball tampering and got sucked into a controversy that ended up with me being taken to court a couple of years later by former English captain and all-rounder Ian Botham and batsman Alan Lamb. The controversy and the furore that followed inevitably hurt the fundraising campaign. We had aimed to open in the summer of 1994, but by the spring the building contractor said we'd have to wait another year. The opening could be no later than December. It really had to open then because in 1995 Ramadan was in February and March. Ramadan is when Muslims make their biggest donations to charity, and we needed that money in order to offer free treatment once the hospital opened. Not only that, but if we had to wait another year, till Ramadan 1996, we would have had to bear the cost of a medical and administrative staff, all of which would have been on our payroll by then for over 14 months. Relief arrived in yet another minor miracle, a new building contractor. Imran Khan was an extraordinary man. He asked to have all the powers he needed and to be left alone to do the job. He succeeded against all odds. But by October we still needed $4 million to open the hospital and had run out of steam again. We were brainstorming one day when I pointed out that many ordinary Pakistanis often came up to me to give me small donations of 1,000 rupees or so. The will to give was there, but how could we harness it? Our advisor and my friend, Tahir Ali Khan, Pakistan's most brilliant marketing expert, suggested I should simply go round Pakistan with a donation box, appealing to the public for funds. Despite skepticism amongst the marketing team, he came up with a plan for a nationwide fundraising trip. First of all, we had a trial run. On the 5th of October we set off with an open truck and a collecting box to the town of Daska, in central Punjab. We had put posters up around the town to advertise my arrival, and within a couple of hours had collected about 500,000 rupees. On the back of that we prepared a whole campaign tour of 29 cities, large and small, running from mid-November to the 28th of December. I would address school assemblies from 7 in the morning up until about lunchtime, when I would hit the streets. Meanwhile, an advance team would go out and speak to the traders' organizations, groups that were to become my biggest fundraisers along with the school kids. What followed was not just an eye-opener for me but a revelation to the people of Pakistan of their own potential. It was during this campaign that I started thinking more about going into politics. I was absolutely stunned by the generosity of ordinary Pakistanis. We did not have to provide entertainment for them as we did with our big fundraising dinners for the rich, but whatever people had, they gave me. Donors flooded to the open jeep where I sat next to the collection box, giving so generously that it left me bewildered. Men would hand over their watches and women throw down their necklaces and earrings from the windows of their houses. I would get back to where I was staying around midnight, usually after a fundraising dinner. At the hotel there would be more people waiting to hand me donations. Sometimes villagers would call me urging me to come and collect the money they had raised. Before embarking on the tour, I had met the editors of all the main newspapers to tell them about the project and request their support. Bar one English language daily, I must say all the papers were extremely cooperative, turning it into a competition by publicizing how much each town raised. After an exhausting 6 weeks we had collected $5 million from the ordinary people of Pakistan. I was quite perplexed to see poor people donating such a high proportion of their income to the project, especially given that it was a cancer hospital and was not going to be in their town. So I would ask them why they were giving. It was always the same reply: I am not doing you a favor. I am doing it to invest in my hereafter. This had a profound effect on me. I developed a love and respect for the people that I must confess I did not have before. One incident in particular touched and inspired me. I had just arrived home in Lahore, my whole body aching from a 12-hour day of collecting cash, when some people arrived at the door. They said they had raised some money for the hospital and wanted me to come and collect it. I could see that they were poor and told them not to worry, that we could manage without their contributions. But they insisted and refused to leave, begging me to go with them. So I climbed into their Toyota, so battered it was barely capable of making the short journey to Shauki Garhi, a neighborhood near Zaman Park. There they led me down streets that reeked with the smell of open sores, me cursing them under my breath, until we reached a small mosque. To my annoyance the money had not even been collected yet. A man used the mosque loudspeaker to announce my arrival and urged people to come and donate. I was so tired and angry I almost hit one of the men who had taken me there, but before I could storm off the locals started to come. The mosque was suddenly filled with people, the poorest of the poor, each offering me 5 rupees, 10 rupees, 15 rupees. My anger left me, I was genuinely moved and had to hold back my tears. I said I didn't want to take their money but they insisted, maintaining they had a right to participate in the campaign and saying they were doing it for the afterlife. Many told me their stories of pain and loss, of loved ones who had suffered and died for lack of medical help. One woman recounted how her son had passed away in a hospital waiting room. The only promise I had to make before I left was that hospital treatment would be free for the poor. It proved to me that generosity has a lot to do with faith and nothing at all to do with one's bank balance. There is all this debate amongst the media, the politicians and the intelligentsia in Pakistan about the extent to which the state should be based on Islam. And yet the common man in Pakistan lives by his religion, day in day out. It doesn't make him a saint but it produces certain qualities, one of which is a belief in the need to give now in order to receive in the afterlife. I started thinking that such people were capable of great sacrifices. Could these people not be mobilized to fight to save our ever-deteriorating country? Surely if there was a sincere government that genuinely wanted to eradicate poverty and injustice in our society, people would mobilize behind it. Pakistan would not then have to grovel in front of other countries and the IMF and World Bank for loans and arms every few months. When I discussed this with the late Dr. Ashfaq Ahmed, one of Pakistan's leading intellectuals, he told me about a meeting he once had with Chairman Mao in the 1960s. When Mao heard that Dr. Ashfaq was from Pakistan, he said, "Your people have tremendous potential." Mao had been impressed by a story told to him by a Chinese ambassador to Pakistan. The diplomat had been playing chess with his Pakistani chess partner, who was fasting in the blistering heat of a Karachi summer. The poor Pakistani was suffering badly, and every few minutes he would pour some water on his head before making his move on the chessboard. When the Chinese ambassador asked him why he didn't just have a sip of water in private, his friend was indignant and replied, "How can you fool God?" From that Mao decided that any people capable of such willpower and self-control must be capable of great things. It was just that the nation hadn't tapped that strength yet. It was in building this hospital that, as well as discovering the generosity of the man in the street, I discovered how hard it was to achieve anything in Pakistan while also battling bureaucracy and corruption. The night before the official opening of the Shaukat Khanum Memorial Cancer Hospital and Research Center on the 29th of December 1994, 50,000 people came out in the cold to celebrate in Lahore's Fortress Stadium. The next day 10-year-old cancer patient Sumaira cut the ribbon in what was the most fulfilling moment of my life. Benazir and Zardari had not forgiven me, however, for snubbing their offer to do the honors. The state-controlled television and radio that up till then had given good support to the project suddenly blanked out both me and the hospital, making it harder to collect donations. Raising the $22 million it took to build the hospital was the first hurdle, but we now needed additional funds for free treatment. The government-paid journalists launched a vicious campaign against me in the papers. Worse, barely a month after the hospital opened, I was hauled up in Lahore High Court and accused of embezzling people's donations. It was no coincidence that the court case coincided with the Zakat campaign launched during the month of fasting to raise funds. The plan was quite obvious. If we treated the poor for free before we had enough money, then the hospital would go bankrupt. If we did not do so, then quite rightly I would be exposed by the government media as a fraud. In a country where the people have been taken for a ride so many times and are so cynical about everyone, they would have believed the worst about me. Luckily, the case against me collapsed immediately. Our hospital had watertight financial controls and total transparency. Our accounts were audited by one of the most prestigious firms in the country. Moreover, I happened to be the biggest donor to the hospital at the time. Benazir's government had not realized that. Also, fortunately for me, the people did not trust the government. They were aware that because it felt threatened by me, it was trying to victimize me. Benazir's government was extremely unpopular by that point and lacked credibility. So here I was already in politics, without actually being in politics. I began to be treated as a political opponent, and a political opponent in Pakistan, whether in a democracy or military dictatorship, gets a rough deal. The entire state machinery turns against you. And in Pakistan, like in most of the developing world, the state is everywhere. My phones were tapped and wherever I went I was followed by a car. Everyone in the government was petrified to befriend me out of fear of losing their jobs. And since we have a big government, one has to deal with government officials all the time. I was left with two choices: either I joined Nawaz Sharif and got the protection of his party, or I had to go to Benazir's royal court in Islamabad and beg forgiveness for not inviting her to the hospital opening and convince her that I was not setting myself up as a political rival. My friend Yusuf Salahuddin, who was close to Benazir and Zardari, advised me to follow the latter course. He warned that otherwise Zardari would destroy the hospital. He offered to mediate. While Yusuf's suggestion was logical, it had the opposite effect. I went on an all-out attack in the press with both guns blazing at the governing couple's corruption. This had a far greater impact on the public than attacks from Sharif's party. Since Sharif was considered equally corrupt, his accusations against Benazir and her husband rang hollow. Especially since Benazir would immediately list the corruption charges against Sharif and his family. Now, for the first time, corruption became the number one issue on the national agenda. Despite the setbacks, we managed to treat 90% of our patients for free that first year. We became pioneers in inventing and innovating fundraising techniques. Today many charities have been inspired by and follow our fundraising model. There were other challenges to come though. Equipment would get stuck at customs, we would refuse to pay the bribes necessary to get it released, and I would have to pull strings. The World Bank awarded us a $1 million grant for a waste disposal incinerator but then withdrew the offer because Nawaz Sharif's government, which followed Benazir's, insisted it went to another hospital. A charity headed by the Argentinian President Carlos Menem offered to give the hospital a shipment of cancer drugs for free. All we needed was a letter from Rafiq Tarar, Sharif's puppet president. He refused and the hospital lost the donation. Most shocking of all, though, was the bomb attack on the hospital in 1996, just a few weeks after I started to talk publicly about forming a political movement. 7 people died, including 2 child patients, 35 were injured and millions of rupees of damage caused. The device, planted under a chair in the waiting hall, destroyed the outpatient and endoscopy departments. If the building had not had such large windows, the whole roof would have come down. I should have been there at the time to show the businessman Naseem Saigol around, but he had cancelled just as I was about to leave home. I don't think I was the target of the bomb, but the innocent lives lost and the destruction caused both saddened and made me even more determined to succeed in my new endeavor. The pressure this incident brought was something I could deal with. I repeated the system that had worked for me in cricket. I blocked out thoughts of failure, and instead focused on what I had to do to succeed. With so many obstacles, if it had been a commercial enterprise it would have closed down, but instead it went from strength to become the biggest charitable institution in Pakistan. In the end, the hospital's success was its best protection. Its work has garnered so much goodwill. It continues to treat a minimum of 65% of patients for free, with another 10% paying a fraction of their costs. And it was still the only cancer hospital in the country, for rich or poor. Sooner or later even the opinion makers would end up there, some for treatment, others to visit friends or relatives. So it became harder and harder for any propaganda against the institution to succeed. Everybody is treated equally, so that even the doctors do not know the difference between paying and non-paying patients. Rich and poor wait side by side in the waiting room and lie side by side in their sick beds. There is no special treatment, no queue barging, no taking precedence. All of this is rare in a country like Pakistan, where the rich and powerful are accustomed to VIP treatment. Today the hospital generates enough money to more than cover its annual operating budget of 3.6 billion rupees. Over half its revenues are now earned through the sale of hospital services, with the rest coming from donations from all over the world. Visits by international celebrities ranging from Bollywood heartthrob Amir Khan to Princess Diana and Elizabeth Hurley have helped raise money too. In 2006 the hospital won the World Health Organization's UAE Foundation Prize for outstanding work in health development. It has treated more than 84,000 people, including myself. I had an emergency operation there in 2009 and my father spent the last 2.5 months of his life there in 2008. Similar hospitals are planned for Karachi and Peshawar, and we are already running outreach cancer screening clinics in those two cities. Revenues from diagnostic centers in Lahore and Karachi and 67 pathology collection centers all over Pakistan are helping the trust increase its self-sufficiency. As for the little girl who cut the opening ribbon back in 1994, Sumaira is now one of the hospital's 1,500 staff and runs the gift shop. Such is the reputation of the hospital today that politicians opposing me are petrified to attack it. On a personal level, the hospital has taught me so much. Most importantly, I learned how to build and run an institution. Crucially, if the leadership follow the rules, so does everyone else. I had learned this as a cricket captain. To discipline the team, all I had to do was to ensure that the senior players didn't break the rules, the juniors automatically fell into line. Secondly, more important than the competence of the CEO was his integrity and passion. Integrity was indispensable, as no matter how competent, a dishonest person could destroy the institution. I'd seen in cricket how passion lifted a less talented player's game so that he could contribute more than a passionless talented one. I am proud to say that today the hospital is a model institution for the whole of Pakistan. Doctors and nurses come from hospitals all over the country to see how our systems work. Along with the Aga Khan Hospital in Karachi, it has raised medical standards across the board in Pakistan. I have also come to understand better the ordinary people of Pakistan, through the small miracles, the bigger tragedies and the simple faith of those I met in the hospital's wards. There I have seen how they deal with death, accepting it as the will of God. Most moving of all was a young boy from Swat I spotted one day when I was visiting the intensive care unit. He was covered in tubes but his face radiated defiance. Impressed by his fight to stay alive, I became caught up in his case, meeting with his father and regularly checking with the doctors on his progress. By that time my son Suleiman had been born, and becoming a father wrought the biggest change on me in my life. It suddenly made me understand how vulnerable we are as parents. So I could feel the torment this man was going through seeing his son fight this life and death struggle. Then one day I went to check up on the boy and was told he had died. I sought out the father, expecting to find him a broken man. Instead he was resigned to his loss, saying it was the will of Allah. I was amazed at how quickly he had come to terms with it. I myself was overwhelmed by the boy's death and couldn't face work that day. I went home. Mia Bashir became a regular visitor to my project office while we were building the hospital, as it was near his house. He was a great source of help and encouragement, partially through his ability to occasionally foresee some pitfalls but mainly because of his great wisdom that never ceased to amaze me. One day we were having lunch in my office. I was feeling a little upset that the construction committee had not awarded the air conditioning contract to the lowest bidder, who happened to be a friend of mine, Imran Khan. During lunch Irshad called up furious, saying that there was something fishy going on as the contract had been awarded to a company that had left 2 projects unfinished and had a poor reputation in the industry. It made me feel even worse. Since he was my friend, though, I could not push his case as it would have been a conflict of interest. Without me telling him anything about the situation, Mia Bashir suddenly told me that the person who had been awarded the contract was in cahoots with one of the members of our construction committee and was not competent enough to finish the job. I was very concerned, but Mia Bashir told me not to worry and that things would work out. Sure enough, a couple of months later that company was in financial trouble and the contract had to be re-awarded. It went to a highly competent competitor which thankfully finished the job on time.